At Michigan State University, you had served in several administrative positions, including executive assistant to the president and corporate secretary to the board of trustees. What were the arguments that convinced you to leave that place and come to UMass Amherst as the deputy chancellor?
So what a wonderful question. As you know, David Scott recruited me to be his deputy chancellor, and I had worked for David Scott at Michigan State University. When he was in the provost office, I had been in the English department at the time as associate chair and then interim chair when the chair was on sabbatical. But I had been on a big project with David Scott, so we had an opportunity to spend a fair amount of time together. He knew me, and when he became chancellor on the Amherst campus, he began his recruitment of me. Well, I had not had any intentions of leaving or moving at the time, but I started to learn and study about the institution. As you know, Esther, I've had a passion for land grant universities, public land grant universities. In particular, there are a couple of private, as you know, MIT being one of them, but I had this passion for land grant universities because of how they were established and what they included. The whole concept of inclusion was embedded in the land grant philosophy. When Senator Justin Morrill from Vermont approached President Lincoln, he had been shopping this land grant for a long time, getting no traction of it in Congress. But in the middle of the Civil War, when he approached President Lincoln about it at the time, President Lincoln knew that the war was going to end one way or another, but in any event, whatever the country was, it was going to need an educated citizenry. And there were not enough institutions in the country, and those that were here were all public and very select for, in effect, the elite in the country. So he was very interested in this proposition that Senator Morrill had approached him with, because the Land Grant Act allowed the sale of land that was federal at the time for the establishment of public institutions that would be for the regular citizenry, the prepared citizenry of in this case in Massachusetts, of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Well, Michigan State University was the premier land grant university. And when I was an undergraduate, John Hanna was president of the university at the time. And as undergraduates, we had a lot of access to him, but he always talked about the mission of land grants, that we were obviously there because the discovery of knowledge was an important thing for the education that was going to be occurring, whether in the classroom or elsewhere. And the elsewhere for him always meant the world. And I remember he used to say all the time that the globe, the campus, is our world. Well, of course, when I discovered, as well as David Scott was trying to recruit me, that UMass Amherst was land grant as well, but from 1863, which was the year after Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. So I started to learn more about it. And I learned, one of the things I learned, that the trustees, just a few years earlier from when David and I were talking, had established a commission called the Saxon Commission, named after David Saxon, who had been president of the California system, and he headed the commission. But the reasons the trustees had done this at the 125th anniversary of the establishment of UMass Amherst was because the Commonwealth of Massachusetts needed something more than what at that point the institution was able to provide. And it expanded the whole concept of it into what became a Research One university. And many of the land grants, as you know, are Research Ones as well. And that was very important. So that caught my fancy as well. And then as I dug a little bit deeper and discovered that there was an acronym on the Amherst campus that said ALANA, ALANA. I had never seen that acronym before and asked about it and learned about it, read about it. And I believe what it stood for was African, Latino, Asian, Native American. So I thought this is truly an institution that, at least in its rhetoric on paper, is striving to be inclusive in ways that were important. And I also knew at the time, from the mid to late 80s, I had been studying some of the work of a man named Bud Hodgkinson. I'd been an ACE fellow in the mid 80s or so. And Bud Hodgkinson, as you know, has done a lot of work in demography. And he was talking about the shift in populations at universities, but in the country generally. And I knew that as he was asserting then, and this would have been the early 1990s or 80s, late 80s, when he was writing it, that come 2018, the United States was going to be 1/3 of a nation of people of color. And by what his projection was in the late 80s was that by 2050, we were going to become as a nation a minority majority. And I thought, well, here it looks to me to be a synchronicity of focuses. Land grant university, trustees that are focusing on a commission that's going to reaffirm and reassert its sort of research focus. And then here was an institution that within its own walls and boundaries was talking about the range of diversity in its students, African, Latino, Asian, Native American. So I said to David, all right, you have my attention. So we proceeded from there. But people who know me, and you know me well, Esther, you know that I'm always trying to hold the larger context, the larger focused. And as a comparatist, that's my context anyway. It's not single, but it's multiple. And David knew that about me. He used to tell me that my whole concept of difference was different from anything that he had encountered before. And that was, I just thought that multiple perspectives, multiple dimensions always added to or increased the excellence of a thing, whatever that thing happened to be. So when I think about why it was that he was able to be persuasive and have me come to UMass Amherst, it was really that alignment of the features that I've just described. So anyway, when I came there to be his deputy chancellor, had no notion I was going to be there for a quarter of a century altogether.
For a quarter of a century, yes. Well, the university at that time was really beginning to look closely at the presence of Blacks and its history with that presence. You were neither the first nor the highest ranking Black administrator in the campus's history, but you were the first Black deputy chancellor. And that was a rarity for a Black person. And it was a rarity. Well, it was a very new position at the campus anyway. We had not had such a position. And it was a position of considerable power and authority. So how was your reception by your white colleagues? Were there times when you felt your leadership was opposed because of your race and gender?
Well, the good thing, Esther, is I think because I had the advantage from early childhood of being taken care of by my great grandmother. And one of the things she was able to accomplish even though as a toddler, uh, I didn't know what she was doing, but she knew what she was doing. She instilled in me a sense of myself. I am what I am, who I am. And I have later come to realize what an extraordinary gift that was. I was actually born on her 70th birthday. And while she was born during Reconstruction, her husband, who was 12 years older than she, had been born in slavery. And he died, unfortunately, for me. I never got to meet my great grandfather because he died 4 or 5 months before I was born. But he was someone that I knew about through my great grandmother, whom we called Pam, because sidebar, one of her grandchildren some years earlier had not said grandma, but used to say Pama. So Pam stuck as the name that we all called our great grandmother. Anyway, I knew about my great grandfather and their relationship through her and also through my mother. I was born on her birthday. She always called me her child and taught me to read when I was 3, taught me to crochet, but I was always with her, always with her. And she would always do things that focused on me, saying things like, well, honey, this is all you. It's all connected. It's all you. But she made me have a sense of myself in a way early on that I'm not sure I necessarily would have had. I'm the oldest of 6, and my mother was having boom, boom, boom children, and my great grandmother, of course, like she said, I was her child born on her birthday. So when I encounter people, I know that I am bringing to situations the whole of me. When I came to the Amherst campus, the me that I was bringing was this well-educated American woman of primary African ancestry who had been taught to pay attention, to listen carefully, to, as Maya Angelou later said, believe people when they show you who they are the first time, believe them the first time. And I always did. And so when I recognize the resistance, the long answer to get to your basic question, when I recognize what seemed to be some resistance, either having to do with my race or my gender, I knew I couldn't be responsible for other people's stereotypes or biases, but what I could be responsible for was for my response to them. And my response was always to know who I was, why I was there, what my job was, what my responsibilities were, and to, again, believe people when they showed me themselves the first time. Not that people can't change, people do change, we all change. But I always believed it and felt that I wasn't necessarily under attack or anything, that I couldn't be responsible for their stereotypes or biases. And the other thing I was aware of was that when David Scott had me come there in that position, I was coming at a time that the campus was having some budget difficulty, and it was a new position. So it made sense to me that people would be saying, hey, wait a minute, why is he hiring a new administrator when
we need somebody, yes.
Yeah, so anyway, but that was sort of my general approach. I like people. People matter to me. So even when I perceived what I interpreted as stereotyping or bias or intolerance, sometimes I tried not to read any more into it than what they first showed me. But I could be responsible for how I responded to it, which was always me, with me, the whole of me. Here I am, folks, Anyway.
And there you were.
And there you were indeed.
But what about the reception by the students, the Black students in particular? Black students had been a presence on the campus in appreciable numbers. And appreciable meaning very small numbers, for only about 20 years when you came to the campus. So, and the Black students at that time weren't feeling very good about the way they were received. How were you able to navigate between the pull of those students and even some faculty who thought that maybe here's a Black woman, she ought to be on our side when we pressure the university to say, open up, receive us, you're not treating us the way we ought to be treated. And then how did you choose between that pull, which was there, as I remember it was there, and then those on the campus who thought, that's not what your job is. Her job is not here to take sides. Her job is to be the status quo administrator. How did you manage? How did you get along with the students, and how did they receive you? What could you do in that situation?
Yeah, that's great questions, Esther. As you watched me navigate this from afar before we even knew each other well.
Yes.
Clearly, the fact that David had created this position of deputy chancellor suggested change all by itself. The position never existed before. David knew me, and I also knew that he was going to undertake a strategic planning effort at the university. And planning, and that's what an institution does to renew itself. So change was in the air. And this was not just about change for Black folks, if you will. This was about change for the University of Massachusetts with its diverse community of students that I had mentioned that were designated or laid out under the acronym ALANA, all right? And David used to say, you know, Marcy, you're really a catalyst, like a catalyst. And he knew that before I became interested in comp lit, I was a chemistry physics major. And he would always remind me that, you know, in chemistry, when you introduce a catalyst into a system, and he would always, well, this was back in the Middle Ages, you know, when you'd have a test tube of something or a flask of a solution, and you would drop a catalyst into it. What happens to that solution? Well, all of a sudden it's agitated and it's just jumping all over the place, and it's heating up. You can feel it if you're holding the flask, it's heating up. But when it settles down, it settles in a higher state from what it was before, and the catalyst is not destroyed. So I always thought of myself as the catalyst that David had hired. Now, he hired me to be a catalyst, knowing my contextual frame of reference generally, but also knowing how I was probably going to fulfill my responsibilities. I remember the job description. My first responsibility was to serve as chancellor in the absence of the chancellor, and my second responsibility was to be the liaison between the campus and the system office. Now, and again, as I was talking about studying the university, like the Saxon Commission and so forth, governance, you know, universities are governed. They have policies and bylaws and trustee documents. And I've always enjoyed reviewing those things because those are like the rules of the game. Like you can't play the game very well and successfully unless you know the rules of the game. And so I was always interested in learning the rules of the game, if you will. But that was the way I was trying to manage through what was the tug and the pull of those who wanted me to be an advocate for them, whether they were Black students or Black faculty or other faculty who wanted to see me as an advocate for Blacks on the campus, or whether the other group, which thought, oh yeah, well, she's just been brought in here to maintain the status quo, and she's a sort of a Black woman as a stereotype. But she's not going to change anything. Well, David had other plans for me and I understood them, and he knew where I was, and I brought me to the party.
Oh, good for you. Good. I remember those days, and there were parties.
Yeah.
I remember plenty of times when you faced um, conflicting demands from white students on the one hand and black students on the other hand, and you devised strategies to getting through that. Can you talk a little bit about what you did to get when you found yourself in the middle of black students on the one hand, white students on the other hand? What about what their lives ought to be like on the campus?
Yes, indeed. I was hardly on the campus more than a couple of months when I was becoming aware of really strong tensions between Jewish students and Black students, because a group of Black students had invited Louis Farrakhan to campus, and the Jewish students were very upset about all of that. And I I feel that communications is so essential, so essential. And I had to find a way to have the campus community, students, faculty, staff, all of us, um, in communication around not just Blacks versus Jews or the Farrakhan's versus the non-Farrakhan's, but a larger discussion. So I also was spending a lot of time meeting everybody on the campus that I could, those in student affairs, others in academic affairs, and just staff generally. I was always late at the office in Whitmore, so I knew the security staff who would come on after 5 o'clock. And so, but because people mattered to me, I just figured that the more I knew about the campus generally, the better I would be able to fulfill the responsibilities that I understood were my responsibilities, broadly writ. So in talking with some folks that I had met through student affairs, a woman named Delphine Quarles, and my goodness, I should look her up to find out where she and her husband are these days, but also a woman named Yehudit Heller, who actually, I don't think she was in Comp Lit. Maybe she was a student in Comp Lit at the time, but she's a published Israeli author. But I had a chance to meet them, talk with them, and we had the idea, well, if the Jewish students were upset because the Black students had invited Farrakhan to campus, who could we invite to campus so that the whole campus community could witness full-throated communication around serious issues? Anyway, we wound up having Elie Wiesel and Maya Angelou on campus in 1995, I believe it was. And I had Delphine Quarles and Yehudit Heller introduce them at an event that we set up in the Mullen Center. We sort of had a stage-like arrangement that looked like a living room. And I thought, okay, let's just have them have a conversation. And so David trusted me, God love him. And so he was probably thinking, now what is she going to do? And of course, Elie Wiesel and Maya Angelou were looking for some sense of what they could do together. But when I told them what prompted our asking them to come to campus, then they understood the larger context of the issue, which helped them know what conversation I wanted them to have that all of us could witness. Remember, Esther, we put those huge screens up in the Mullen Center.
I certainly do. I certainly
And
remember
so
those.
they came on, and after Delphine and Yehudit introduced them, they sat in like living room type furniture to have this conversation. And both, of course, had been guests on the campus at some time in the past before my time. So, and of course, everybody knew who Elie Wiesel and Maya Angelou were anyway. So there wasn't that whole issue. But what did strike me at the conclusion of that evening was how, with rapt attention, everybody in that Mullins Center was just hanging on every single word that the two of them uttered. And this was about issues of race, issues of difference, issues that were at the root of conflict generally. And they exchanged conversations about this. Well, I remember Elie Wiesel had an appointment in New York the next day, and we had arranged to have a car available to get him back there, to drive back to the city so that he would be there in time for his appointment that day. And we had arranged to have Maya Angelou staying overnight at the, what was the name of that? Oh, the Lord Jeffrey
Yes.
Hotel. Is it still there? Is it still?
I think the Lord Jeff has undergone some changes. I don't know if it's called the Lord Jeff anymore. I think maybe it's
Yeah.
changed a bit, but it's there. It's there.
So what I learned,
I remember.
Yeah, what I learned is that Elie Wiesel delayed the car and driver that we had for him to drive back to New York. And he and Maya went to the Lord Jeff for a late dinner. And they were so caught up with the power of what they had just done in the Mullins Center for the rest of us that I learned later from Maya's agent, I believe, that the two of them, as he said, took this show on the road to 2 or 3 other universities over the next couple of years or so. But it spoke a lot when they talked about feeling or understanding the power of what had just happened. So that was the first of what I called Cross Worlds, a conversation intended to get at the issue, the base issue, the fundamental issue of things that were in conflict or troubling to people in the community, not just the campus community, but beyond.
You brought some others too. You this worked, and you kind of kept this thing going of bringing guests to campus. Remember some more of them that you brought?
I do, Esther. And sometimes I say half of my life is serendipity. But again, one of the things that Pam, my great grandmother, taught me was to pay attention. Everything coming across you that you're looking at, pay attention. And it's all there for a reason and for a purpose. And I remember a professor in the School of Education at the time, a woman named Pat Griffin.
I remember Pat, yes.
Yes. I don't remember the circumstances under which we met and had the conversation, but she was doing some work at the time having to do with suicides among young people over their own personal conflicts having to do with their own genders and their own orientations, their own sexual orientations. And she, in fact, a lot of her research was on that topic at that time in the early 90s. And I remember she was working with a couple of the local schools as well, because there were several suicides that had happened even in middle school and before students became ninth graders and so forth, that in the at the high school, Pioneer Valley High School, I think it was. In any event, I got to thinking about that and I thought, that's probably just the tip of an iceberg, the few cases that she was telling me about and writing about and so forth. And I remember recently that Bart Giamatti, who used to be the president at Yale, I believe, had become baseball commissioner, which had been his goal in life, to become baseball commissioner. And I had just read that he had fined and kicked out of the game or barred him from X number of games Pete Rose, a big baseball guy and so forth. But because what Pete Rose had done was to say something bad to one of the umpires, an umpire named Dave Pallone. He was the first umpire, maybe the first one in professional baseball in such a position to come out. And Pete Rose must have said something to him when Rose came up to the plate. And that caused Bart Giamatti to take the action of penalizing Pete Rose because of this. And nobody penalized Pete Rose, but Bart Giamatti did. So I thought, maybe I can do something along these lines of a cross-worlds conversation. So the other person I invited into the conversation was Martina Navratilova, great tennis star. But I explained to Martina and to Dave Pallone the context that I was working out of, called Cross Worlds, and the need that I thought was in the society based on what I was learning from Pat Griffin and her work, Griffith and her work. And they agreed to come. And it was, again, I think I had Pat introduce them that night. But what was so moving about that event to me, I get goosebumps now when I think of it, is that through their conversation back and forth about coming out and their sexuality and issues around that, the stereotyping, the biases around it, and so forth, the crowd, and I think we were in a place that had we were in one of the auditoriums, but there was this center aisle. People just were getting up uncalled to the stage and coming down front to come up to the stage where Martina and David were. But they were using that moment, that event, to come out. They had not been out before. And oh my gosh, it was just so moving, so moving. And I thought, if we can get the right kind of communication going in many different ways to get at the root cause of these issues that bedevil us, and they continue to bedevil us to this day, but at least the communicative effort is going to be there in a way that keeps it in front of us rather than under the covers or in the closet and so forth. And another one of these was Martina and Dave must have come in, it must have been 96. And then in 1997, I had Coretta Scott King and Congresswoman Pat Schroeder come. And of course, Coretta Scott King had picked up the mantle from her slain husband from 1968 and his assassination to carry on all of his work that she was front and center for. And Pat Schroeder was carrying on in the House of Representatives as, well, first of all, she was the first woman on the, I think it was the Armed Services Committee, kind of breaking a ceiling there, like armed services, a woman on the committee? I don't think so. Well, yeah, we thought so. And she was, but she was also an advocate around parity for salaries for women and so forth, or socially just things between genders, if you will, men and women. And she was just relentless. I think, I'm pretty sure Pat Schroeder is still alive now. She's probably our age, Esther, but she was always the voice, the advocate. She, by the way, had toyed with a presidential run back when, that was absolutely unheard of.
Yeah.
But I remember having one of our congressional delegation, or the State House, Ellen Story. I had Ellen Story introduce, trying to think which one she introduced. I think she introduced Coretta Scott King.
She did.
And then I was trying to remember, oh, I know, the provost at the time, Cora Merritt, it had her introduce Pat Schroeder at the time. And so again, that was another one. And I only did one more of those cross worlds, which was much later. It was in 2002, 2001 and 2, actually, when I was chancellor. one of the things I wanted was for the campus to have an opportunity to meet people who really lived their values, not just espoused them, but who really lived them. And you'll remember the case of Amy Beale, who was killed in South Africa as she was helping
Yes.
with the registering and so forth. And the young men who killed her. There were 4 of them that were sentenced to prison and so forth. But during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Archbishop Tutu oversaw, those 4 young men had applied for amnesty. That was part of what the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was. And in support of their amnesty request, the parents of Amy Beale, a woman named Linda Beale and her husband, Peter Beale, they came from their home and jobs and works in South Africa in California, rather. They came to South Africa to testify in support of the amnesty application of the 4 young men who had killed their daughter. And I thought to myself, well, now there's people who live values that they espouse. They aren't just talking about them, because I had watched people just not figuring out how they could possibly not just have forgiven the young men who killed their daughter, but testified on behalf of their amnesty request that they would be released from prison. So
Yes,
when I
that was
was,
amazing.
yeah, so when I was chancellor, I arranged, I have a long history in South Africa, but I had arranged to meet the Beals in Cape Town, where they had gotten their own flat at one point and established the Amy Beale Foundation Trust there. I was actually on that, I served on that board for a while, several years ago, but I arranged to meet them and to tell them about this thing I call Crossworlds, and that I wanted our campus to have the benefit of meeting people who lived the values they espoused, not just talked about them. So I invited them to campus, and this would have been November of 2001. And I had wanted, because 2 of the young men that were released from prison actually wound up working at the foundation, the Amy Beale Foundation there in Cape Town. And I wondered if they would consider bringing them with them. And they said, but of course. And so we tried to do that, but we had trouble getting visas for them in time for them to come, because remember, they were convicted felons, having committed murder, even though they had been what's the right word, cleared, exonerated, or whatever, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But this was just after the US had experienced 9/11, and getting visas was very difficult for people from certain countries, and certainly people who were convicted felons previously. So the 2 young men who worked at the foundation weren't able to come in November when Peter and Linda Beale came to campus, but we had them on campus, and they were in the community. They met with groups at the school, in the local schools. They met with some of the classes on campus, but invariably the question was always from the audience, what does it mean? How could you forgive people who had killed your daughter? And
Yes,
just to listen to them talk, it was something we came to call Amy's magic, you know. But anyway, Peter and Linda were on campus for about 5 days, or in the area about 5 days. And we were still trying to figure out how maybe we could have the young men on campus, which, as it happened, occurred several months later in May, or it was May, yeah, of 2002. Peter unfortunately died shortly after they had come to the campus as a thank you visit en route to California to meet their first grandchild. But he had an undiagnosed cancer, and he was dead within, oh gosh, a week or so of having been on our campus at the last time. But Linda was in New York as a guest of one of the psychological associations, I guess. And she was bringing the two young men with her to that, called me and said, Marcy, I'm going to be in New York. If the invitation is still open for us to come, I have the two young men with me. And sure enough, in May, I think it was May of 2002, Linda Beale, along with Isi Nofumelo and Ntobeko Pene, they came to our campus and had a conversation about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about dealing with conflicts, why they killed Amy, and all of those things. It was just amazing to me to not just to hear the story again. And by the way, in preparation for having the Beals come to campus earlier, there is a documentary called A Long Night's Journey in Today.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I got a copy of that documentary. And by the way, it was nominated that year for an Academy Award. It didn't win, but it was one of those nominated. It was about
Yes.
4 cases of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I thought, well, in order to prepare the campus for the visit, so we had that showing over the networks for the students in the residence hall, and we showed it to different groups, the chancellor's executive group, the deans, and so forth. I still recommend that film. There are 4 cases
Yes.
in the film
Yes.
having
A
to
great
do.
film. Yes.
And one of those cases, of course, has to do with the death of Amy Beale. And there's a powerful scene toward the ending of the film where Peter and Linda Beale go into the townships where one of the young men lived, and they went to meet the mother of one of the young men. And the woman is standing there and she's shaking her head, saying to them, you know, in effect, my son is out of prison because you testified on his behalf, but I'm looking at you and you are always going to have an empty seat at your table. And they were hugging each other. It's powerful. It's powerful, just powerful. That was the last one of the last of the Crossworlds.
What a great place to stop. Marcy, I think of those days so often now. These days, I think of those days with all that is happening in our world. So, you know, it occurs to me to ask, do you think there are special responsibilities of minority administrators?
Well, let me speak for me. When I go back to saying, like, when I first came to the campus, I knew who I was, I know who I am, and I would hope that that would be true of everybody, but of minority administrators who find themselves in the position still, unfortunately, being the first or the only or the handful of a few, if you will.
Yeah.
And again, because I'm a contextualist, I'm going to go back to mission statement and what's the context for these things. And that always sends me to our Wellman document, which is our governance document for the university. And in that document, and again, because in my former life at Michigan State, when I was secretary of the board, I was dealing with trustee policies all the time, and it sticks in my head that way. But for UMass, the Wellman document is T73-098. In that document, it spells out the responsibilities for each constituency for the campus, for students, what their primary responsibilities are, for faculty, for administrators, and for trustees. So I always begin there. All administrators have a responsibility, from my perspective, to be aware of and adhere to the governance document of the institution, the university of which they are a part.
Yes.
Now, if that administrator happens to be a minority administrator, a person of color, and a person of color who is aware of one's self, then that is the bonus that you bring to the party, if you will. That's the bonus that you bring. So I think I always felt that, and to always have a sense of integrity about who I was and why I was doing what I was doing, whatever it was I was doing. And the whole matter of social justice, there's no such thing as social justice for Blacks and social justice for whites. There's social justice. And that's what I saw as my responsibility. And so that was my context for it. And it continued to be that, Esther.
In the 7 years that you were deputy chancellor, what was your greatest achievement? If you can separate the deputy chancellor years from the chancellor years, because I'll want to know if there was a different feeling, a little bit of feeling that comes with being chancellor that you get that you don't have when you're deputy. So let's start with that. You have 7 years as deputy chancellor.
Yep.
What was your greatest achievement? And then what was then I want to follow with what was your greatest disappointment in those years?
Well, this may come as a surprise, but I'm going to mention technology as my greatest achievement. One of the things David had put under my purview was Office of Information Technology. And when I first came to the campus, I remember there were 7 different databases on the campus, and none of the databases spoke with each other. And David said to me in his way, Esther, you can, I'm sure, hear, Marcy, we are never going to have another start of a new semester unless you find a way that we can address these 7 databases who don't talk to each other. And so I thought, okay, I know what my task is. And again, paying attention to notice how I was going to solve this particular problem, which took money, obviously. So when I say the technology was important to me, and it was one that provided access to everybody on the campus, not just a select few or whatnot, but I had found a way, because I learned about something that I knew nothing about before I came to UMass, called certificates of participation. We used to provide telephone service, remember, Esther, to our partners or schools were connected in the area. And there had been, just shortly before I arrived, a new switch, something called Ericsson, that had been connected and installed and so forth, but the switch needed to be upgraded. So I remember the head of OIT at the time, who reported to me, say that it was time to upgrade the switch, and we needed to go into Boston and have a conversation with bond counsel in order to proceed with upgrading the switch. And I said, okay, but fine, but before we do that, tell me about this Ericsson switch. Tell me about all of this. And he did. And learning has always been my best mode. So I was just sort of eating up everything I was learning about technology. Long story short, get into Boston. In this meeting with the attorney at bond counsel, she has all these papers spread out in front of her, and I'm at the other end of the table. And I see her studying these papers. And she looks up at me and then looks at the papers again. And I knew she just spotted something. I needed to figure out what she spotted. And she looked up at me again. She said, Dr. Williams, have you ever refinanced certificates of participation? I said, didn't miss a beat. I said, no, but I think I'm about to find out about it right now. And I did. I never heard of certificates of participation before I had come to UMass, but this was part of the refinancing that needed to occur, or a part of the upgrade of the switch that needed to occur. Anyway, she showed me a way that if we refinance these certificates of participation that had been used to finance this phone system, if you will, for want of another or a more elaborate phrase, that had gone in for our campus, but for the local schools or the universities that we supported, that we could generate millions of dollars. And so I said, yes, this is something I'm going to do. This was before cell phones, but there was a phone in the car. And I had been driven in by the chancellor's driver, and there was a car phone there. And I grabbed that car phone. I called David. I said, David, I've just figured out how we can get $17 million with which I can use to upgrade not just the switch here, but to connect all of the buildings on this campus with technology, Wi-Fi, to set in motion some smart, I didn't use the word smart at the time, but computerized classrooms, provide equipment in labs that anybody could access, not just people because they could own a computer, but anybody and everybody and so forth, and have money left over to come up with a system that integrated the 7 databases that we had on campus, none of which could speak to each other. Well, we did that with PeopleSoft became that system, if you will, whereby the 7 heretofore databases could speak with each other. So while on the one hand, it doesn't look like anything special for Black students or faculty on the campus, but it was, because it was there for everybody with equal access to it, everybody learning about it at the same time, not needing to come lately and catch up for something because they've been disadvantaged heretofore and so forth. So when I think about that time as deputy chancellor, that was the one that I was most pleased about. And I think as you say, the thing that was disappointing to me, remember I had said that my second job description responsibility had to do with being liaison to the system office. I always felt that I hadn't done as good a job as I needed to do with that. And not all states have systems, but those who do, there's always a tug, a pull, if you will, between the president's office and the particular campuses and so forth. But that can be a healthy thing. And because system offices are legislative entities, system offices don't have students, they don't have programs, they don't have faculty, but it's the entity that the legislature deals with and gives money to, that the system office then distributes among the campuses. But I never felt that I had done as good a job with that as I had wanted to. And so that would be one of the disappointments. I felt that the changes that were going on with regard to issues of race or inequalities or lack of social justice, because I was trying to keep those front and center for people, whether with Crossworlds or generally just talking about things, communicating. I felt those were coming along slowly, but they were coming along. But I didn't have that same sense about the connection with the system office.
Mm-hmm. Well, after 7 years, you no longer had David to call.
Right.
Telephone when you needed to run things past somebody. You were it. You were interim chancellor first, and from interim chancellor, you got to be deputy chancellor. Were there initiatives that you were able to advance as chancellor that now that you're here, you said, I'm gonna get this done, that you couldn't do when you were deputy, when you had David sort of stopping you? If he stopped you, I doubt if he ever stopped.
Well, you know, a deputy is always a second, not setting the agenda, though part of an agenda always. And if you choose to be a second, you choose also of necessity to complement the agenda rather than to openly resist or push against it. So one of the things I think I tried to do was to be more open or transparent with faculty council, with the rules committee. I just engaged them more in things that I suppose one could think of as, you know, the business of administrators, if you will, or whatnot. But they were also part of the campus and governance groups. You know, there are lots of ways of participating in governance, whether it's delegated authority or advisory or consultative or even shared, but there are different ways of participating in governance. And so I wanted to have people participating in multiple ways as was appropriate to the particular group, like the rules committee. The rules committee, I mean, the decision would eventually have to be made by the head of the campus, but I wasn't going to proceed with those decisions without fully engaging intentionally appropriate groups and committees, whether it was faculty groups or student groups as well. So that was one thing, Esther. And again, I think the other had to do as well, because I met with the group of chancellors and the president. So I wasn't the liaison from the campus anymore. I was the head of the campus and had a rather different relationship with the president, if you will, of the system at the time, who was Bill Bulger at the time was president of the system. Yeah. So I don't know.
Well, here's something that you did when it fell to you to appoint an interim provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs. You selected a Black woman. You selected our friend Charlene Seymour.
Sure
did. Was this met with resistance in any way? I suspect it was.
I'm sorry. What was the last part of the question?
Was this met with any resistance?
Oh, heavens, yes. Heavens, yes.
I suspect.
Yeah. First of all, decisions like that in any event are never going to be unanimous with a faculty group, as you know. But it was easy for me because she was the best one for the job at the time. She was known by the campus. She and respected fully by the campus. She had been chair of the department. She was dean of the graduate school, and she carried on with aplomb everything that she did. And while there may have been some who would have preferred that there, even at that point, had been a search or more consultation that I've been talking about, this was one of the times that I thought it was important for a decision to be made. Actually, there was a transition there because David Scott was in the process of exiting at the time, but for about maybe 3 weeks or a month, Shar was going to be provost under him as chancellor.
That's
so
right.
It was, yeah, so there was going to be an overlap, but so interim was appropriate then. But again, for all the right reasons, she was the best person for the job. David and I hardly even had to discuss that at any great length. And of course, I felt for even those hardliners who felt, no, this is not right and so forth. I felt vindicated when my successor, John Lombardi, who did this international search for provost, identified Shar as the candidate.
Oh, yeah.
Which was no surprise to me, you know, and he and I used to joke about that. And he said, well, you know, thanks for the early vetting. That was an easy one and so forth. But yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, Marcy, most people in this country remember exactly where they were and what they were doing on September 11th, 2001. Most everybody at the university at that time also knew where you were at that time, because you were our chancellor then. You were not an interim, you were our chancellor by some few days, was it? You had just
something.
recently been made chancellor. Uh,
Uh, that
and
was
there
a,
you were. Can you talk about that? What made you, how did you get through that time?
oh, I've been thinking a lot about September 11 recently because this year is the 20th anniversary of it. And
That's,
yeah,
that's exactly right.
it's, and what a day that was. But you know, Esther, when we assume or agree to assume leadership positions like this leadership position, you do so knowing that there's going to come a time when there is going to be some kind of crisis that needs attention. Now, could any of us have predicted that? No, but crises by definition aren't always that predictable anyway. But you know that when they occur, not only are you having to deal with your own feelings, your own reaction to it, but you have a responsibility to lead a community, to stabilize it, to give them some assuredness that in this case, that life will go on despite the fact that that so many were killed on that given day and the horror of it as well. I remember we were in a meeting over in the Graduate Tower. It must have been a budget meeting we were having over there that morning when, wow, when I got a telephone call there and it needed to take it in another room again. And Janet Thomas, who had been my assistant when I was deputy chancellor, was on the line, and she was calling to tell me that there had been an attack on the Twin Towers. There had been this attack. And I think even while we were on the phone, the second thing occurred, because the reason we knew, or no, when she called, she said, there's been an accident at the Twin Towers. A plane has struck the Twin Towers, and it's a plane out of Boston on its way to California. And the reason that rang a bell with us all was because we knew that one of our own was on that plane, Christopher Carstanian. He worked in OIT, and we had just seen him off the day before. Chris was one of these affable technology types, you know, not as nerdy as some, but more engaging. And he had so many uh, interests and so forth. And I think he was completing a degree through University Without Walls. But we were also aware that he had this long-term relationship with this girlfriend, and he hadn't proposed to her. And finally, he was going to go to California as part of what she thought was only his coming out for one of the motorbike events, that because motorbikes, that was part of his interest. But what Chris was going to do was to take an engagement ring and ask her finally to marry him. So we knew the flight that Chris was on, and we knew that if that's the plane that struck the tower, that Chris was dead. And while while Janet was on the phone, the second plane had struck the second tower. And so that's when it became clear that it was not a random accident, but a terrorist attack. And I just remember ending the call, coming back into the meeting, telling everybody in the meeting that there had been a terrorist attack on the Twin Towers, and we needed to end the meeting and get back to Whitmore and start to process everything we needed to process. That was a frightening day in so many ways, because then, of course, we were learning about the Pentagon, and then we were learning about the plane that was also headed for the Capitol that went down thanks to that wonderful group that took it down and sacrificed their own lives to save the Capitol and many other lives and so forth. But the stabilization of the campus, the attention to the people who knew that Chris had died. I had to get employee assistance programs for those in OIT who knew that Chris had died, or those of us who knew that Chris was on that first plane. And just, it was chaotic, but trying to think, okay, now what do we need to do? And, Esther, when I became chancellor, I had established a website by accident, actually, because I had invited, this is sort of a side to explain where I'm going with what I wound up using the site for with regard to September 11. But I had invited a group of reporters, journalists up to the chancellor's residence so they could get to know me and get to ask whatever questions they wanted to ask and so forth. And one of the reporters there had said, remember he said, so Chancellor Williams, what's your philosophy of education? I had never been asked that before, certainly had never written one before, but I knew I had to have had one. And I responded to him by saying as much and saying, well, I certainly know there are elements that constitute it. And why don't I commit to you to have all of this put up on my website that I'll have established within a week or two or whatever I told him. And that's what caused my establishing a website. And it was a good thing I did, because I put everything on that website that I was doing as chancellor, all my speeches, everything. But I also was able to use that as September 11th, posting notifications. People were calling us in the chancellor's office to tell us that their loved one had been on that flight and their loved one was an alum of the university and so forth. It's an archived site. And I think I sent you the URL on that, but yeah, but it's an archived site. And over the years, I've had occasion to look at it, but not frequently at all. Sometimes like on the 5th, 10th, 15th anniversaries, I've had people ask if they could use certain quotes or certain pieces of it to give them permission to do so. I've done that. But what we did on that day ultimately is start to use the site to post things that the campus needed to know about. I remember I needed to walk the campus. I needed to have people see me. I needed to have a visibility so people knew that that they mattered, that we cared what had happened, whether they knew anybody or not who was in the towers, on the site or whatever. But I also then remember trying to gather all the appropriate people so we could, okay, what are we going to do about classes tomorrow? Oh, really? Classes, right? What happens there? And going through a whole list of things that needed attention. Boy, a separate aside. As you know, Esther, and I was talking earlier with Erica about this as well, what happened in South Africa yesterday. And
right.
the head of the University of Cape Town is a personal friend, but UMass and UCT have long had relationships and contracts of what agreements of one kind or another. But she sent me, I saw a copy of the letter that she wrote yesterday. And these are notifications to your students, faculty, staff, community that have to be timely. That needs to get out right away. And it has to have the right tone in it to soothe, to be soothing and not to get people more anxious than they already are. And it needs to be comprehensive in that you want to be sure that you are answering the questions that people will have about whatever they have. And when I was reading last night her letter that she had written to the community, I sent her a WhatsApp text and said, Gaiety, I can only imagine what this day has been like for you, but you have provided for your community, your constituency, in my opinion, everything that they need right now. And she had done that. She had had to evacuate the entire campus, uh, find places for students to sleep last night, let alone eat. But Ramadan, remember, just started last week, and students needed to be able to be in places where they could celebrate the breaking of the fast. And she had attended to all of those things. She had done that on top of everything that was going on, recognizing that they had lost their special collections in the Heritage Library. I mean, just historical things. And it was just enough to make many of us weep. But those are the moments that leaders, if you take on a leadership position, you have to be prepared for in whatever way you can be. There are all kinds of emergency management booklets or, checklists for doing X, Y, or Z. But you do that as a matter of course, a matter of being sure that the safety of your community is intact, that people feel stable rather than not. And it's hard to feel stable when towers are crumbling and lives are being lost. I remember I was sitting in the chancellor's office with a team around me as we were maybe trying to get one of the letters together. I'm not really sure what precisely was the point, but our receptionist, Ernestine Coulon, came in and with a note and passed me a note and said, you have a telephone call, and then you need to take it in Jim Laney's side office. And I looked at the note and it said my sister-in-law was on the line. Well, I excused myself and I went to take the call. She was hysterical. She said, Al's on that plane, Al's on the plane, Al's on the plane. She was just hysterical. Well, my brother, one of my brothers owned an ad agency in New York at the time, and they had been in Boston the previous day to pitch something they were pitching to a company, or I don't know what that was all about, but he and his director of design or something, whatever, were there, and they had been doing this over dinner or whatever on September the 10th. But they didn't finish because their prospective client wanted more information. So they agreed to meet again for an early breakfast the next morning and go from there. And Al could, and his director of design could still catch the flight. Well, traffic in Boston, being what traffic in Boston is, and maybe this was at the tail end of the big dig and everything. And it was just, anyway, they missed the flight. They got to the airport as, things were shut down or closing. But his wife didn't know that he wasn't on the flight. So she was the one who had called me in a panic. Al's in the flight, Al's on that flight. And she was hysterical. And they have a young daughter, Mara was, gosh, how would she have been? She was maybe, I don't think she was quite in high school yet, but anyway, I asked her where she was, and Pat was a teacher, she was teaching. I said, go to Mara's school, get Mara, and go home and stay there. And we'll try to figure out something from here. So and if you remember that day, it was very difficult to get telephone calls anywhere. Everything was just, it was so sporadic. After a few attempts, I was able to reach one of my other brothers to let him know about Pat's call. And he said, I'll take it from here. And he did. Well, we didn't know until later that night what had happened, because once it was clear that it was a terror attack at the airport, they had detained everybody. Like, what do you mean you were supposed to be on that plane? Well, why weren't you? What's, da, da, da. Anyway, he and his director were detained. Now, I never thought of this before, but we're talking race. So maybe to some extent there was a matter of race caught up with it. Because his director was white, but he's black. Um, and so he was detained and not able to use a telephone to be in touch with family or anything. But my other brother, who let's just say, had ways of contacting agencies that knew how to get at least basic information as to a manifest of a flight or something, had discovered that Al had missed the flight. While we didn't know exactly where he was, we knew he was still in Boston, but he was not on that flight. So uh, my second brother then could call and take care of my sister-in-law, and to get a message to me to let me know that Al was safe and so forth. So, but that was going on personally for me, but I had to put it in a little spot in my head that didn't have me freaking out because we had a campus to deal with. And, it has taken me several years to absorb more and more of what was happening that day. And every time something comes up, when I realize I'm emotionally reacting again to some of the horror that was going on. I remember when I left the Amherst campus, or as chancellor, John Dubach was saying something at a reception once, and he talked about the day that, because I had John Dubach as my deputy chancellor at the time, and so he was walking the campus with me that day, and he described my having stopped them and stopped and said, "Wait, John, let me talk to this student." And I approached two students, a man and a woman, and but I seemed to know that something was wrong. And it turned out that she was missing um, a relative who worked in one of the towers, I guess, and couldn't find out the detail of it and so forth. But John said at that going away party or whatever it was, he said, I had no idea. How did you know that, Marcy? How did she know that the student was in trouble? The interesting thing was when he was telling it, I didn't remember it until he started to go into detail of it. And little things have happened over the years that have me realize that it took me years to process the various pieces and the various parts of it. I remember when was it, about 1997 or something, mid 90s. Yeah, somewhere in the mid 90s. Do you remember the big earthquake in Northridge, California, 6.7 or 8 or so, or 7 on the scale? And it practically destroyed the entire campus there at Cal State Northridge. And a woman named Blenda Wilson, African-American woman, was president
Yes,
of that campus
yes,
at the time. And I knew Blenda through the American Council on Education, and I've listened to her talk about her experience that day, because she was some 150 miles away from campus and trying to get back there and trying to stabilize everything, and the earth was moving and crumbling and buildings were falling and so forth. And I remember watching Blenda talk about some of those things over some years. And one of the things I have remembered, is that when she talked about some of it, she said she never remembered it all at once. It came in pieces to her because she was so focused on communicating safety and stability to the campus community, which was a prime responsibility for her. So that's what when John Dubach made the comment that he made, I was thinking, yeah, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that I didn't remember that until he started to talk about it. I do remember that Yankee Candle sent to campus all of those little votive candles. So I pulled together the group of us on campus around the campus pond. And
yes,
all of this and I put up on the website um, what happened at the campus pond, because student trustees, student governance folks were there. And I put up on the site everything that we said and did around the pond. And that was on a Tuesday when that happened. And on Friday, the then president of the United States had declared that the Friday was going to be like set aside as a special Memorial Day for honoring those who had lost their lives. So there was a second event around the pond as well. And I put all those speeches up there, mine, the one from the student trustee, from the president of student government, because those needed to be captured. I also had put Chris Carstanion's picture on the site. Years later, by the way, we awarded him because he had just a couple of credits left to complete his degree through University Without Walls. We awarded him his degree later, but that's all archived and on that site. And I suppose I'm, grateful to the reporter who asked me the question if I had a philosophy of education, because I don't think I started out thinking about putting up a site in that regard. But it's, it's umass.edu, past chancellors, Williams HTML, with the appropriate slashes or whatever is there. But it's all there still on the site, and all the speeches connected with that event. By the way, I think also on the site are all the things connected with the Amy Beal parents' visit and the days and weeks that they spent with us as well. But it's all there, and I'm glad it's there, because I don't think I could reconstitute it all even now. I mean, maybe if I'm prompted, I could, but I don't really think I could reconstitute it all. But it was very important for me to have a sense that the campus was more stable than it had been. That was a terrifying day. I have no idea what's going to happen this year on September 11th, what my reaction or response will be, but maybe I'll go back and read more of what we did on the site. When we came back from the campus pond that Tuesday night, when I came back, people were just, there were 25, 30 of us that poured into my office. We were sitting on the floor, sitting around, and I remember sitting at the computer and listening to people, because I had to write something else for us, update on things that were going to happen in the next days, where people could get help if they needed help, and so forth, and an opportunity for people to say out loud what was in their emotion, and to not hold this stuff inside that needed to come out in safe space that mattered, and so forth. Those were all important things, very important things for me. Remember, there was a big accounting finance firm at near the top floors of, I forget which tower, but Cantor Fitzgerald. And our Eisenberg School, because it is so well known and so highly ranked, we have a lot of alums in that tower. And had that attack happened a week later, we would have had student interns in that tower as well, with Cantor Fitzgerald, who had arranged for internships or visits and so forth for some of our Eisenberg students and so forth. So that attack had a very, very personal feeling to everybody on that campus, it was a time, but we lived through it.
Well, you got us through it, Marcy. I remember I was there. We couldn't have asked for a better leader. You touched us all individually and gave us the strength to pass on the strength to our students. It was a big, big family affair, and I will always remember how much a leader you were. You were great. You were great for that time, all times.
Well, I have sometimes felt blessed to be able to do what is needed to do in the moment. And I go back to Pam. She just reminded me it's all connected, it's all there. And while I may not be religious anymore as I was maybe 50 years or so ago, I have never in my life been more spiritual than I have become over the last, I'd say maybe even 25, 30 years. And that was part of, I mean, I, that was part of it clearly. I mean, I do nothing by myself. I know that.
In your writings, you have suggested that the concepts of multiplicity, inclusivity, and all of the others that crop up from time to separate us, all of those as found in the ideas put forth in the mission for a land-grant institution. They have shaped your sense of what you should teach, how one should teach, and how one should be as an administrator, from leading to hiring to managing to assessing. And you seem to have been, you practice all of them, Marcia. You were very present. You were a very present administrator, as I recall, and of course a very good friend. But I want to know, even despite our friendship, there you were, a very, very good. Had nothing to do with friendship. It was my clear objective that you were really a present person among us. So now I'd like to ask you, you've been away from the campus for a bit. How would you assess the growth of the Amherst campus with respect to those ideas from the time you arrived to now, when you left it, when you got it to when you left it? How did you think it's come along as a land grant institution?
Yeah. I do see growth in it, if nothing more than it's something I talked about forever and continue to talk about because I believe so fully in it. When you think about the tripartite mission of a land grant university, where the whole notion of discovery of knowledge it's a public trust. And then the education of its students based on that knowledge is like a moral obligation. That's how I've always seen it, as a moral obligation. And then, of course, by virtue of it being the land grant, we don't sit there in the ivory tower and navel gaze. We take the knowledge that's been discovered, the education, we take it beyond the walls of the university to engage the community, the nation, the world. As I mentioned, John Hanno had been president at Michigan State University years ago when I was an undergraduate student. And he used to say all the time, the world is our campus. The world is our campus. And that stuck with me. And it also stuck with me because while Pam, my great-grandmother, had never been out of the United States except to go across the border into Canada, because Detroit and Canada is just across the river from each other, by the way. She always, when she was teaching me to read or when we'd be reading, she'd always taught me how, always ask how, always ask why, how is this connected to that? And whether we were reading in one of those little, Esther, you might remember those little golden books that we had.
I do. I do.
Yeah, it would be how is all of this connected? We're all in this world, or like Pam would say, we're all God's children, that sort of thing. And I understood that, not in some, here's an old folk talking to me, but gosh, we really all are, and we all matter. And I think that's where the sense of people matter has come from as well, because while we're all human, each of us brings to this world something no one else can. And we are singular and we are multiple at the same time. And so having a land grant tradition with this tripartite discovery, education, engagement, all integrated, it's been my life's work, and it's life's work that I have loved, and it's felt like I was made for that life's work, is how it always felt to me. And I think and I remember the current president of the university said to me last year at one point, he said, Marcy, you were the one that taught me what land grant was, well, whether I did or not, the fact that he even asked or made the comment suggested that this was part of a vocabulary that he didn't have before, and likely had given it some thought. And that was the good thing. That was the good thing. So, but communication to me has always been the key, whether you're communicating across worlds in the cross-world sense of the events and so forth, or whether you're really communicating across worlds, as we were doing yesterday with our colleagues in South Africa as they were undergoing the trauma of what is happening there,
Yes.
and so forth and so forth. Anyway, I don't know if that really answered your question.
Yes,
or not.
I'm glad you were there for them. You were able to get in touch with your colleagues and friends at Cape Town yesterday. I'm very, very glad about that. I have two more short little questions now that I think sort of begging to be asked of you. When you reflect on your work at the UMass campus, what are you proudest of? You've done so much. You had such a wonderful, engaged life there with us. What are you proudest of?
Wow. I don't know that I can just say one thing. I think I've mentioned some of them already. The technology piece was very important, and was more like a stepping stone, a foundation for some other things that needed to happen. And when I was chancellor, well, it always is the case that one of the board members that's usually on the fundraising or advancement committee will set a goal for fundraising for each of the campuses. And I remember that was a very bad budget year for the university, 2001, 2002. And he set a goal of 30 million for the annual fund that the chancellor was responsible for leading and arranging and accomplishing. And I did that, even though I knew he didn't expect me to. I just knew it, It's like, what's the line? Believe it when they show you the first time.
Yeah.
But it was satisfying to me in that I knew he didn't expect me to do it, and I did it. But more importantly, I did it because the campus needed the money. That was the important thing. So it wasn't for me, but again, it was for the campus. But that was a very big.
But I hope you took some pride in doing it, Marcy, and showing him.
I did.
Good.
I did. So.
And what was the hardest thing you had to do?
Oh, yeah. In January, I mentioned that bad budget year. In January of, I guess that was 2002, I had to lay off more than 90 people in a single day. Jane Swift was governor at the time, and we didn't get a budget in the state that year until, you're supposed to get it in July. It was more like late November, December, around Thanksgiving, just after Thanksgiving. And then in January, we had what was called, is it still called 9C cuts? Do you remember that phrase or anything? Anyway, it's a rescission whereby the governor or the treasurer goes into the financial system of the institution and simply withdraws the money. The money is not there. And so you have to do something immediately. And that was salary money for people. And a friend of mine recently, well, within the last year, sent me the front page of the Springfield paper from that date. I'm like the whole top of the page is my picture, which was taken just as the reporter with her photography had come to the chancellor's office to say, so Chancellor Williams, how does it feel to lay off 96 or whatever the number was, 96, 97 in a single day? Snap. That was what captured the picture.
Mm.
All I could think of was that night when I went home, I just hung my head in the toilet. I mean, I just, it was so heartbreaking to me because these were people I knew. You know, I used to walk the campus. I knew people. I knew folks, grandkids on the campus, and or knew about the grandchildren if I didn't know the children. And I didn't want people of this 90, I didn't want them to hear it on radio or television, but I wanted to tell them myself. But I had to, I remember that day well, because, you know, there are deadlines for press, for the print newspaper, and then there are deadlines for the 6 o'clock news with cameras and all, you know, and all of that. So I had arranged to have the people with the longest length of service to the university and their supervisors meet with me individually in the chancellor's office. But I had to figure out how to process this list of about 96 before the 3 o'clock deadline or whatever the early afternoon deadline was for print, and then later with camera trucks showing up and so forth. So I couldn't do it one-on-one with people, but I tried to do it in smaller groups so that they heard it directly from me. And these, you know, some of them were people who, you know, I call it laying off, but they were let go. The jobs didn't exist anymore. We couldn't. It was a euphemism to say I laid them off. But these were people who probably hadn't written resumes in years, if ever, and so forth. But I also knew that the campus had a responsibility to take care of these people. They're still our neighbors. We're going to see them in Stop and Shop or in churches or synagogues or mosques. We're going to see them. And so they aren't a pariah. They're the same people they were the day before for us, but now they don't have jobs. So we set up things in the university for them to learn how to do things like write resumes again, or to have employee assistant programs deal with the immediate shock of all of these things. But we tried to help them with bridging gaps to things and services that they would need now in this new reality. That was one of the horrific days and things to deal with. And the other, of course, and we keep mentioning 9/11, but 9/11 was very, very hard, very, very hard as well. But in conjunction with the budget issues, I remember a meeting that had to have had maybe 200 people in the room, and I had to tell them I was closing childcare on the campus because, well, what I should also say is I had the year before, as we always anticipate preparation for a new budget year, we need data, you need information, we need things that we have to be sure we have on hand to help us make the decisions we need to make. So we had a lot of data. But one of the things that the data had shown in this tough budget circumstance was that we were spending more money per child in childcare than the cost to have an in-state school attend the university. And I could just hear trustees saying, "Oh, really? And how long have you known that, Chancellor Williams?" You know, so we had an angry room of parents when I let them know that come thus and such date, there would no longer be child care in the university. Now, what it prompted in the end was that once, or they maybe used the anger to fuel a solution to a problem so that the university was not continuing to pay these enormous costs for childcare, but there was a better distribution of, or better allocation of where how the costs were being taken care of and so forth. But I remember after that meeting, which was over in the campus center, when the meeting was over, all I could do was just head for the door, walk out of the meeting and into the parking structure. And I remember I was going like a son of a gun, just walking, boom, clickety, 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 clack. And I was aware that somebody was behind me, and it was John Dubach, who was my deputy chancellor. And he called out to me and he said, are you all right, Marcy? Oh, Chancellor, are you all right, Chancellor? And I just shouted back without even stopping, no. And I kept going. And I got in the car and I thought, I'm going to break. I'm going to break. Because, if I had come to pick up my child from childcare one day, pick up Jonathan, somebody said, well, we're not going to be here on thus and such date. Can't deal with it anymore. I would have been one pissed off person, pardon me, but I would have been. I would have been. And so I understood what was coming at me, but I also hurt because of it for them. It's when we forget that people matter, we're all in trouble, in my opinion. Yeah, we're all in trouble when we forget that. Anyway, Esther, did I answer the question you asked?
You answered the question as you always do, and you did it well. You did everything. What did you leave? Anything unfinished that you wish you'd finished, and how would you finish it if you had the opportunity to finish it?
It's the relationship with the system office, which I had an opportunity to attend to again when I was then in the president's office in that senior vice president position, because I had dealt with all of them as deputy chancellor and chancellors. They would call me and say things to me, such as, I remember one colleague used to call and say, Marcy, the president wants, and then would fill in the blank and so forth. And so when, as a colleague then in the system office, he would come up with that line again, I say, hey, listen, you'd always call and say, well, Marcy, the president wants. And I said, and I'm sure the president did want it, but I don't think the president knew you were calling me to tell me what the president wanted. I said, but, we have to find other ways of collaborating with the campuses rather than dictating to the campuses when dictation is not the order of the day. I mean, there are some things that maybe have to be dictated on occasion, but not usually. There's consultation, there's advisement, there's the sharing of information. And so I had a chance to spend more time doing that, Esther, and I did appreciate doing that. I will say this, because I know you tell me I don't toot my horn is not the right phrase, but when the medical campus established some fellowships, not exactly fellowships, but hefty opportunities for their faculty to engage research and study on their own. They named it after me. And it's not an insignificant amount of money. It's like a 3-year at $60,000 a year for each of those faculty members. And they named it after me, and they had a small dinner with some of the leadership and the first recipients of it. There were 3 or 4 people receiving it. And I remember the chancellor of the medical campus saying, you ran tackle for us a lot between the president's office and the campus, but I never felt that I was doing anything more than my job, that my job was to smooth the ground so that faculty, staff, and students could do what we hired them to do, what we wanted them to do when they came to the university, rather than setting up obstacles or making it difficult for them to accomplish and to achieve. There is one thing, Esther, I realized I did want to mention with regard to one of your questions, because I did the same thing in the president's office. Sometimes we neglect to remember that we have systems, things that we can use to further our own goals. For example, search committees, orientation programs, whether it's for new trustees or new faculty or staff or whatever, we don't always use those opportunities as we might to help people know what they need to know in order for them to carry out their jobs more effectively. And so I would always build into search committee orientations, faculty orientations, trustee orientations, things about mission, things about land grant, things about achieving better goals when we smooth the pathway for folks rather than putting obstacles in their path. You know, years ago when I was still in the classroom teaching, I remember saying to students in one of the classes that we succeed when we're not needed anymore. And by that, I meant parents succeed when their children really don't need them anymore. They've done their jobs and their kids are off doing what they ought to be doing. We don't, you know, so parents succeed when their kids don't need them anymore. Doctors succeed when their patients don't need them anymore. And teachers succeed when their students don't need them anymore. But you know how tough it is to preside over one's own declining purposes? It's a killer. It's a killer. And one of my friends, who happened to have been a physician whose specialty, she taught in one of the medical schools. There were 3 medical schools on this one campus, if you include vet med. But her specialty was anorexia and bulimia. And at the end of each semester, we would usually meet for lunch. And Chris used to say, I feel like crap. I don't know about you. And we got to thinking about the why of it. Well, her kids who were friends with my son, we're all getting older, needing us less. Her patients were getting well with they no longer had anorexic or bulimic issues, and her students in her anatomy classes or whatever the classes were learned what she was presenting and on to something else. She said, you know, Marcy, we're worthless. We just presided over people that don't need us anymore. No wonder. Let's just, instead of just having lunch, let's go to a bar. And so, and drink to us. We're still standing. But you know, when you really stop and think about it, that's kind of what a catalyst is like as well. Get it in there. I didn't think of that until right now. Get it in there and shake up that system, get those kids learning what they need to learn, get your students learning what they need to learn, get your patients well, and boom, they're out there going. And what are we? We're still alive, didn't kill us, but man, we're not like we were before. So we pick ourselves up and start all over again.
And start
Esther,
all
thank
over
you.
again.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, Marcy, my friend, thank you. It's been wonderful to sit with you. It's been wonderful, as it is always wonderful. I miss you.
I
miss you
you
very
too.
much.
Maybe post-COVID, I get to come and we can sit on your porch together and just.
Yes. Oh, yes, Marcy, do that. Listen,
Wow.
is there any question that you wanted to answer that I haven't asked?
You know, if we're really wondering about the Black experience at UMass, maybe it should be some sort of assessment question. Years ago, when I used to do orientations for teaching assistants, I've probably observed 300-400 classes over the years back in the 70s. But there came a point when I stopped observing the teacher in that class and turned my attention to the students. And I don't know when that happened, but I became aware that it had happened. And so maybe we could think about some, and maybe the chancellor has been doing this on the campus, and because I've been away a while, and I think he has been doing some assessment. So if this is important to us, we need to know its effect or its impact or how things are coming along. So the assessment question is probably it. And it could well be additional interviews with people who were there then and are still around, and to catch up to see how they assess all of this
Yeah,
as
I think, yeah,
experiences of their own. Anyway, I think I've talked enough.
I thank you so very, very much. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Esther. Thank you for approaching me about this. I love that university, as you know,
Yes,
and I don't think I would automatically have said yes to anybody else who was asking. So thank you. Thank you.
I love you, Marcy. I
Love
love
you
you.
too, honey.
All right, Erica, that's it.